Welcome, everybody, back to the Pop Culture Retrospective Podcast. I am so unbelievably excited this evening to welcome Mr. Saul Austerlitz to the show. Just a quick little introduction about him. He attended Yale University and graduated with a degree in film studies. He is a professor at New York University in writing and comedy history. His work has appeared in notable publications such as the New York Times Magazine, the Boston Globe, and Rolling Stone. And I wanted to make sure to mention that I read your article about the Berenstain Bears, about kind of the shift in their books and the focus. And I actually did a show about one of my episodes in the last couple of months was about the Berenstain Bears. And I really appreciated your perspective because I see the whole situation exactly like you do. Very well said. He's also a proud partner to Becky, and he is a dad who has been very understanding about my evening schedule for doing interviews, which I certainly appreciate. And he is the author, you can see a few of the books here, author of Money for Nothing, A History of the Music Video from the Beatles to the White Stripes, sitcom, A History in 24 Episodes from I Love Lucy, excellent show, to Community, Generation Friends, an inside look at the show that defined a television era, which I am currently reading, which is an excellent book. And finally, what we're here to discuss tonight, kind of a big deal, how Anchorman stayed classy and became the most iconic comedy of the 21st century. So Saul, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is exciting. So before we get into all the wonderful things that you've done in this fantastic book, which I'm sure people are going to think I'm biased in saying that, but this just amazing book. My first question for you is, when did you know that writing, comedy, and pop culture were going to play an important role in your life?
That's a great question. I feel like I got really into the idea of writing about pop culture when I was a teenager. I remember going to see the movie Pulp Fiction. I'm dating myself now, obviously, but I went and saw it and it blew my mind. And I felt like, wow, I have a lot to say. I have a lot of thoughts about this movie. And yeah, that just sort of set me on this track of feeling like it would be amazing to get to have the opportunity to write about pop culture and think about it and share that with people. And it's been really amazing and wonderful to actually be able to have had that opportunity.
Yeah, I think something I was reading about you said that did you convince your parents to let you get the screenplay to
yes.
Pulp Fiction or something like that?
Yeah, I liked the movie so much that I asked my parents if they would go to the bookstore and buy me a copy of the screenplay, and just studied it.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's so great. That's nice when parents are so supportive of their kids' aspirations, whether they're a teenager or an adult. And I think my parents are my two biggest fans of this show and are very supportive. So that's really great that they were so accepting of the stuff that you were into, because that's certainly a very specific request of something to purchase. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Parents must be good people.
My parents were always awesome about it. Yeah, I'm so appreciative.
Nice. Excellent. Awesome. So in 2004, a bunch of notable comedies came out. We had Napoleon Dynamite, Sideways, Meet the Fockers, Along Came Polly, and Dodgeball. What was it about Anchorman, also released that year, that made you decide, you know what, this is a story that needs to be told?
So first of all, I definitely want to shout out Mean Girls as well.
Oh, yes.
And the subject of my friend Jennifer Cation Armstrong's forthcoming book, So Fetch, which I've read and which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So paired 2004 movie books.
Yeah.
I think I loved Anchorman. It was one of those movies where I saw it and just was like overcome with hilarity in the way that only happens very rarely. And the movie stuck with me. And I think so two things happened. One is, I think with the passage of time, I've come to appreciate what a rare kind of comedy it is that keeps entertaining people, keeps amusing people, keeps finding ways to make people laugh. And I think part of it for me as well is sort of realizing that what was once a brand new comedy, just kind of the latest iteration of what film comedy was doing, has become representative of an era that's now over.
Yeah.
I look around at the current comedy landscape, and there's lots of incredible stuff being done. Very little of it is happening in the world of feature filmmaking. And there are lots of interesting reasons, I think, why that's the case, and maybe we'll talk some about that.
Yeah.
But I think in some ways, part of what motivated me was this realization that Anchorman is now kind of representative of an era of comedy that we are not really in anymore. And so one of the ways that I got started, I kind of came to this in a somewhat accidental fashion. I
Mhm.
teach a class at NYU called Writing About American Comedy. And so it's sort of half a writing class and half learning about the history of American comedy. And so the first week of class, I showed the students Anchorman, in part as a little bit as a provocation. The more time passes, the less students even know what Anchorman is necessarily. But
Yeah, that was gonna be my question. Yeah.
right, with the idea that students either they come in and they've never heard of the movie, or they come in and they sort of pump their fist that, oh, the professor's showing Anchorman, that's awesome. Or they have a little bit of like a scowl on their faces of like, why are we watching this dumbass movie instead of
Yeah.
something better? And I think part of the provocation is to get students to break out a little bit from that idea of comedy being disposable or dumb or bad, and to see even this movie. I mean, I've rigged the game somewhat because I've selected Anchorman, but like even the movie that you might think of as being kind of fun but sort of pointless has all of these different avenues of approach, all these different ways that you could write about it.
Yeah.
And so we do that in class, and I have the students write like a brief essay. And it took me years before I had this, belated teacher teach thyself moment where I was like, oh, I should write about Anchorman. I have a lot to say about this. So that's sort of how this whole project got started.
Wow. That's so awesome. And to my knowledge, not much has really been written too much formally about kind of the creation of Anchorman. So I think learning about the sort of the behind the scenes information I found to be incredibly fascinating. And I think the reason why this book is so interesting and so well done is because it not only tells you sort of the story about how Anchorman came to be and kind of information about the plot and stuff like that, but there's also a lot of different layers to the story too, about a friendship, about persevering, about not giving up. And I think that that's something that certainly people could relate to.
I always think it's so remarkable to hear the stories of how these projects that end up becoming beloved films or TV shows or, other works of art come to be, because they often are just filled with moments of despair and basically giving up hope that this project is ever going to come to be. And all sorts of people who are, polite, but essentially utterly dismissive of these works. And, one of the examples that I have in the book is in the early phases of pitching what would become Anchorman, Adam McKay and Will Ferrell are invited to do a reading of the film at a studio called New Regency. And it goes amazingly well, and everyone is just rolling on the floor. It's such a funny script.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's just a giant hit. And so Adam McKay goes over to one of the producers, one of the executives afterwards, and says, "So how'd that go?" And the guy is like, "Oh, this was amazing. What a fantastic way to start the day. We were so happy. Like, so do you see any, what do you think about the hopes for the movie?" It's like, "Oh no, we're never going to produce anything like this."
Yeah.
So, I think that one of the things that Adam McKay mentioned when I spoke to him is that, they got rejected something like 35 times over the course of 2 days. And so
who knew? Gosh.
yeah, and I think it's easy in retrospect to say, oh, obviously everyone knew that this was going to be a giant hit, but a lot of people didn't, right? They didn't quite see what was there. And I think it's fascinating to kind of come from that angle of people looking at this and saying, I don't know what to make of this project. Is anyone going to see it? Is anyone going to like it? We're just not sure.
Right. Yeah. I could see, yeah, that's true. Yeah, kind of looking at it in hindsight, maybe people couldn't quite maybe picture it in their minds of sort of how is this going to sort of turn out and evolve. But what an amazing film that it came to be. And I certainly remember seeing the trailers for it, and it certainly seemed a little bit silly to me. And I think something that you mentioned in the book and that I think a lot of people have commented on. It's one of those films that you think it's funny the first time that you watch it, but each time that you continue watching it, it just gets better and funnier and more insightful the more that you go on. So how did you go about researching this book? So you said you mentioned you talked to Adam McKay a little bit, the director, and he and Will Ferrell, you mentioned, met on the set of SNL. And so how did you go about sort of researching the rest of the book?
Yeah, I tried to reach out to as many people involved with the film as I could. And one of the things that I've discovered is that often the crew members whose names might be less familiar have the best stories, in part because they haven't told those stories to journalists 100 times already.
Yeah.
And in part just because they're present and paying attention, and sort of taking in all the details of how things came about. So some of the best material that I ended up getting was from people who worked on the film as crew members, and that was fantastic. I also got to speak to people like the editor, Brent White, and the costume designer, Deborah McGuire, who just had tremendous detailed knowledge of how the sausage got made and all the details of how it came about. And so that was really wonderful. I also got to speak, I ended up having a bit less of this in the book than I had initially planned, but I spoke to a whole bunch of people who had worked in improv and sketch comedy with Will Ferrell in Los Angeles and with Adam McKay in Chicago.
Yeah.
And even though I ended up having a bit less of it than I had planned for, I felt like understanding where the two of them came from and sort of what their roots were comedically was tremendously helpful for me in kind of understanding their partnership and understanding what made them work so well together.
Yeah. Yeah, that was, I think, one of my favorite parts of the story is the background about how they came to develop it. And I think you mentioned that they spent a lot of time at, was it Will's pool house or something like that, or some like a house behind the house, a guest house, and they would just kind of spend hours there working. And I feel like I was just sort of envisioning that in my head. And then I was also thinking to myself, if the sort of the backstory behind Anchorman were ever to be put into a movie, who do you think would be able to play Will Ferrell, and who do you think would be able to play Adam McKay?
I love the idea of there being that movie.
I would see it immediately.
Great question. I interviewed Adam McKay via Zoom, but I understand that he's very tall, so it definitely would have to be someone very, very tall. It's hard for me to picture anyone other than Will Ferrell playing Will Ferrell, but someone from the younger generation of SNL could do the ideal version of him.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, there's that younger guy does Donald Trump really well. That I can't think of what his name is, but I'm sure he could somehow embody Will Ferrell pretty well.
Yeah, I like that idea. I endorse that idea.
Yeah, same. That's, I think, what I appreciated so much is that we, as consumers of media, just think, oh, he's this big movie star. He was on SNL. They just kind of, threw this thing together and it became a huge hit. But the backstory is that it was, I think the first story, it was supposed to be something about being used car dealers or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah. So there was first a previous script, which was an Anchorman, that was about used car dealers and sort of had a lot of themes that kind of feel familiar, having watched their later films. So, a guy who's on top of the world, who's the number one car salesman in Anaheim, California, home to Disneyland, and then has this sort of sudden and tumultuous fall from grace and has to figure out how to put his life back together. So kind of similar themes to something like Anchorman or Talladega Nights. And so, that script was very popular and people really liked reading it, but no one wanted to produce it. And they sort of decided at some point, okay, either we can quit or we can kind of take another stab at things and see what happens. And so one day, Will Ferrell was watching television and he was watching, the A&E used to have all these biography episodes of various people. So he was watching a biography episode of the new television news pioneer Jessica Savage, and they had one of her fellow anchors, a guy named Mort Krim, was on, and he was kind of talking offhandedly about how, well, it was the 70s, so we were all a bunch of male chauvinist pigs.
Yeah.
And something kind of sparked in his head. It was like, oh, this could be something. But the initial idea for Anchorman was something completely different. So it did involve sort of newscasters and these kind of like blowhard newscasters. But the initial plot involved all of the newscasters getting onto a plane to Philadelphia for a newscasters convention, and then somehow the plane crashing in the wilderness. This is very much, a sort of unsung ode to the 1993 movie, I want to say, Alive.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Yes.
Crash in the wilderness. They end up having to fight off monkeys who have some sort of throwing stars that they attack people with, who are also on the airplane that crashed. There's cannibalism. There's a lot, and I think they showed it to people, and people were like, "This is great," and also, we don't know what to do with this.
Yeah.
And one of the things that ended up happening was DreamWorks was interested in working with them, and basically brought in Judd Apatow, who was a somewhat better known name, although not yet having done most of the things that people now know him for, and asked him to help them kind of see this script through. And I think the interesting thing in terms of the dynamic, first of all, you would think in a scenario like that, there'd be a lot of suspicion and misapprehension. Oh, Judd Apatow's coming in, he's going to ruin our script, or he's, the studio's monitor.
Yeah.
Instead, he really encouraged them to kind of go further, right? He was telling them, okay, you have all these great ideas and you're at sort of a 9.5 on the silliness chart, but let's have like a little bit more humanity in here. Like, let's have a little bit more character and personality, but also the places where you've kind of hinted at something silly and over the top happening, like write that in the script. And so one of the places that he pushed for that was in the scene that they started developing of this like Anchorman showdown. And so they'd sort of sketched out a little bit of what they anticipated happening there. And he was like, okay, let's actually like say more here, give us more of what you're picturing. And I think that encouragement was really profound for them, that someone wasn't just telling them, okay, you guys are funny at all of the like excessive over the top stuff, now write a very bland comedy, but instead saying, let's cut back in some places and let's build in other places.
Yeah, I think that was one of my favorite parts of the books, was again just sort of anticipating, one, kind of having an easy ride to getting this movie done, and second, sort of the stereotypical director who just everything has to go the way that they want it to go, and they're putting the kibosh on everybody's ideas. But it sounds like between Judd Apatow and Adam McKay, they really encouraged the actors to just kind of be themselves, and if they had creative ideas or something that they thought they could do funnier, to do it, or to go off script and film it and keep going. I think that was one of the coolest parts of the book.
Yeah, I found that really fascinating as well. And, not to bash a whole series of movies all at once, but, the story of Saturday Night Live sketches that have become movies is a little bit mixed, I think.
Yeah.
A movie like Wayne's World is excellent. I think some of the other ones are not quite as good.
Definitely.
Clearly, it's hard to take even an extremely beloved SNL sketch and make it into a feature-length film. And Anchorman is not that, right? It's not actually based on an SNL sketch, but it very much has the aura of the SNL sketches, that sort of delirious what-if sense of, okay, we'll have this happen, and then this even crazier thing will happen, and just sort of building and building and building.
Yeah.
It's one thing to be able to do that for 4 minutes in a sketch, and to do it for 94 minutes in a movie is a whole other skill.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that McKay does in terms of planning out this movie is saying we are building off of that SNL model of bringing in people who can just sort of maneuver on the fly and make changes. And when they finally get the go ahead to make the movie and they're casting, the sort of main thing that they're looking for is people who are comfortable doing that. So they have they have, the added bonus of having Will Ferrell as the star of the movie, right? So they already know the star of the movie can do this.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that works so well for them, one of the things that Adam McKay mentioned, is that it was easier to write the film when you had the star of the film sitting in the room writing the script, so that they could write a line for Ron Burgundy and then have Ron Burgundy say it and say, okay, this line works or this line doesn't work. We're literally hearing the actor delivering the line. But even in terms of casting the other roles, they were really looking for people who are comfortable with improvisation, and sort of knew how to do it. And so Steve Carrell is someone that Adam McKay knows a bit from Chicago, been in a Second City troupe with Steve Carell's wife, Nancy Walls, who had also been on SNL.
Oh, that's right.
They had Steve Carell had shown up at one of their performances, and they had sort of pretended to humiliate him to the point where the audience was turning on them for being so mean to this stranger in the crowd.
That's right. Yes.
And even someone like Paul Rudd, who didn't have quite that same, sketch comedy background, they end up selecting him to play the role of Brian Fantana instead of Bob Odenkirk, who's the other finalist for the role and someone who has way more sketch comedy experience, because Paul Rudd was so gung-ho and so, willing to say and do anything to get the role, and also showed that he was comfortable when they just sort of threw it to him and said, hey, here's what's happening in the scene. Just think of a line and say it. And that turned out to be a very good bet. And even Christina Applegate, who also did not have that same kind of sketch comedy background, had been on Married with Children for a whole bunch of years at this point, hundreds of episodes of Married with Children. And so I think that same sense of just being kind of a comedic veteran, someone who was going to be thrown by anything, really spoke to what they were looking for here.
Yeah. Christina Applegate, what a perfect fit for that role. And I think you mentioned there was somebody else at that role they initially had in mind to play that role.
Yeah, they looked at a couple of different other performers, each of whom would have been fascinating in the role. So Judd Apatow was initially pushing a bit for his wife, Leslie Mann, to be in the film. And I think that she's one of the best things in Apatow's films, like Knocked Up.
Yeah.
So I think it would have been really interesting, but they sort of felt like they wanted someone who felt a little bit more like a traditional leading lady was the feel. And they also looked at Amy Adams, who they really loved, and who McKay ends up casting in his next film, Talladega Nights. But the concern was that she seemed she felt a little bit too young, that they were worried that audiences would wonder at how this actress who looks like she's 20 has had all this experience already in terms of her character.
Yeah.
And they also looked at Maggie Gyllenhaal, who McKay also loves. And he was like, saw Maggie Gyllenhaal try out for the film and said, she's obviously going to win an Oscar at some point in the future. She's like the next Meryl Streep, and you cast Meryl Streep in this movie. So that's how they ended up with Christina Applegate.
Yeah. She does such an outstanding job. I really enjoyed watching her because I grew up watching Married with Children. It's one of the shows that I like to say. I talk about my dad a lot in my podcast, and it was one of the shows that we were sort of forced to watch as children and or teenagers or whatever. But in hindsight, I think that show is hysterical, and it's one of those things. I think now that I'm a parent and I'm trying to get everything done and work and stuff and balance everything, I can kind of understand where Al's coming from. So having her was a great addition to the show. I was going to say, during all your research, what is something that you think surprised you the most about the creation of this movie?
Yeah, I was definitely surprised by the length of the road to get there, like we had talked about. And I think for me, one of the most interesting parts was just kind of understanding the process of how the writing got done and how the writing changed over time, and maintaining that sense of openness to, yes, we've written the script, yes, we're happy with it, but also on the day, we're going to see what happens. Like that, that feels that fascinates me in part as a writer, because the idea that you would work so hard on something and then say, okay, but then also we're just going to let a bunch of people like noodle and see what happens. Like, it's very foreign to me. I admire it greatly, but it's like not, it wouldn't be how I would work. And so I think it's fascinating that, you know, after them putting in years writing the script, you know, one of the things that Adam McKay mentioned was that he would tell actors, like, there's nothing that will focus your mind as much as being there on the day that we're shooting, like being in costume, seeing the set, seeing the background, seeing the other performers, like that intensely concentrates the mind in a way that nothing else can. And I think he and Will Ferrell were both giant believers in that sense of, when we put all the pieces in place properly, kind of magical things will happen that we couldn't anticipate in advance. And one of the things that people mentioned, I was very curious, again, as someone who's like, you know, always thinks that we should polish everything in advance. It's like, okay, you were improvising, but to what extent were you like pre-preparing your improvisation, which obviously indicates how well I'm a comedian. And they're like, no, that's not what we did. And one of the things that other people were mentioning to me was that Adam McKay in particular is such a gifted improviser that he could just, like, in the moment, kind of call out a bunch of different possibilities for actors to try out, or for things for people to say that would be just as good as the things that were in the script.
Wow. What an ideal, I mean, I can imagine for all these talented improv actors, this was probably the ideal setting to make a movie where your skill set is encouraged, and there's people, the director kind of can relate to you because they've sort of been there, having been at Second City, which, plug for Second City. I grew up near Chicago, love Second City. I try to get to a show every time I'm there. But what an ideal setting for all these actors to be together, and just a very, for lack of I guess for kind of a cheesy term, just a very inspirational, encouraging environment.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I was trying to emphasize was the extent to which this exact setup was so discouraged in most other films, right? So in addition to all of the other stuff, I think there was a notion that, okay, allowing actors to improvise is wasting money, right? That, like, it's so expensive to shoot a film, it's so expensive to have everyone be here. The notion that you would then say, okay, let's now like play together and we'll see what happens, was very much not what most sets prior to this film were like, or what they encouraged. And so I think it took it took a little bit of Adam McKay kind of bucking the conventional wisdom of, fine, you're an SNL success, but like, this is how we make movies, and instead saying, no, we're actually going to import this style, this version of doing things, and work with that.
Yeah. Oh, what a fantastic setup. So this movie is now, you know, almost 20 years old. Why do you think it still resonates with people?
I think it still resonates with people in part just because it's an exceptionally well-written piece of comedy and it still makes people laugh. I think it also resonates because that sense of kind of watching someone say and do terrible things, but also kind of get their comeuppance, I think really speaks to people. And I think that one of the interesting things that I found in revisiting the film, the differences between watching it in 2004 and watching it now, is that in 2004, I think it was a little bit easier to take the film kind of at the surface level, or sort of take it on its own terms.
Yeah.
In the way I thought of Anchorman was that it's very much a movie about kind of the, quote, bad old days, right? So we're watching a bunch of people, bunch of men, saying and doing terrible things, secure in the knowledge that all of this is happening a long time ago in the 1970s, meaning that we're sort of being given permission to laugh by virtue of it being these troglodytes from an era that's long gone, and where we know everyone and everything is so much better now.
Yeah.
And I think post, let's say, 2016, it's a little bit harder to accept that particular perspective. I think, you know, the Ron Burgundy-esque people are still very much present and still very much making themselves heard loud and clear. And so the
Sure.
movie, I think, plays a bit differently than it had initially done, because this notion of, okay, we're looking at bad behavior, but it's all over now,
Right.
is no longer. I don't think it's possible for us to accept that as a perspective. But I find that rather than making the movie not work at all, it just sort of strips away a little bit of that exterior cladding, and we're kind of getting a sense of what misogyny looks like, basically, or like what the logic of it is in the minds of the people who are expressing it and propagating it. And then also still getting that sense of comeuppance that Veronica is just
Yeah.
smarter and craftier and wilier than all of the rest of them combined.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of explaining it, because I think it is so well done. It is hitting on a very serious topic that has impacted people, all over the planet, but they're able to do it in a way that, yeah, like you said, sort of separates you from it and kind of makes the people who are doing and saying these awful things kind of look like the idiots, for lack of a better term. So I think that has made it, just the rewatchability factor pretty significant, and it's still funny. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if a movie like that came out, around now or even a few years ago, what the response to that would have been. Because certainly, like you said, I think in 2004 it was much easier to digest a film with that sort of focus on it, compared to
Yeah,
now.
I think that's absolutely right. I do think that there are a lot of similarities thematically between Adam McKay's earlier work and his later work, right? I think often they kind of get separated out into two totally distinct pieces. You have the Will Ferrell comedies, and you have the serious, Oscar contending movies.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, they're much more similar than they initially appear, right? So Anchorman is about a bunch of men behaving badly, and The Big Short, which was nominated for, a zillion Oscars, is also kind of about a bunch of men behaving badly. Different context, different setup, different way of sort of making it all happen, but
Yeah.
not dissimilar. And also, Anchorman is very much a movie about the news media, and something like Don't Look Up is also, very interested in kind of the excesses and failings of the contemporary news media. So they're, approaching things from different angles. It's not like they're exactly the same movie, but
Yeah.
the themes feel pretty consistent across all of the director's work in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting how much he made this shift from these comedic movies and working so closely with Will Ferrell, and then he's now sort of off doing something completely different. It's interesting that he decided to sort of break away from that, and I wonder why. I wonder why that is.
Yeah, it may be a product of having looked at Anchorman as many times as I have, but I definitely feel like there are a lot of big ideas in there that are kind of searching for ways to get out. And it's very much in the context of this broad comedy. But I think that I suspect that some of them moved away from the Anchorman style, towards the later work, like The Big Short and Vice and Don't Look Up, is about, well, how do I take this model, right? That includes improvisation, and it includes, sort of an overall kind of satirical style, and also have a receptacle that I can put more of my ideas into. So it feels more like a progression, right?
Hmm.
And I'm even thinking about something like The Other Guys, which is the last of, well, I guess, the last before Anchorman 2, but
Yeah.
it got kind of mixed reviews from critics when it came out, and rewatching it now, it's not a perfect film, but it's a much better film, I think, than people remember. And I think in part some of the confusion was people went in thinking that they were going to see, like, in their minds, like a totally silly, over the top comedy.
Yeah.
And was that, but it also had like a lot of ideas about the financial crisis, and people were like, well, I don't know what to do with this part.
Yeah.
But I think that was just sort of the transition, towards these kind of satirical comedies of ideas that he's been playing with more recently.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think you're right. Yeah, progression. I think that maybe that is a good way to sort of look at it, is just sort of getting more, kind of complex and evolving. So that certainly, makes sense in McKay's case. And you mentioned, kind of earlier in the show that, you feel like movies sort of like Anchorman are not really made anymore. And why do you think that is?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was just thinking about this recently for a piece that I was working on for the rollout of the book. And I think, it's definitely notable and noticeable that there are just way fewer comedies at all being made. And, kind of putting Barbie to the side, Barbie, I think, is just this like exceptional, amazing phenomenon and also a really wonderful film by a great filmmaker.
Yeah,
That's also a comedy in some senses. It's also a musical and lots of other things. But
sure.
other than Barbie, there hasn't really been like a big blockbuster comedy that everyone is sort of buzzing about and talking about, and there are think pieces about, and people are writing about it on Twitter and whatever else.
Yeah,
Really, since Bridesmaids, which was over a decade ago.
yeah,
And I think that it's a couple of things in one. I think one part of it is that we've seen just like the overabundance of intellectual property driven movies where everything is a sequel or a reboot or
yes,
some like instantly familiar story. And comedies don't really lend themselves to that all that well. Sometimes there are sequels to really big hit comedies, but not so much recently. And it's harder to pull that off. And I think the other part of that, when your film schedule is so much, Star Wars and Mission Impossible and Jurassic Park and those kinds of movies, those are movies that generally travel well, right? They do well internationally. I think it's much, much harder to sell a comedy overseas, right? Like the specificity of the jokes is complicated and doesn't always like literally or metaphorically translate very well. So I think those are some of the pieces of it. And then I think the additional part is that by virtue of what's happened, we haven't really gotten that next wave of comedic film stars.
yeah,
So again, there are so many brilliant comedians working in popular culture in general. It's just that when you think about it, almost all of them are working in television, right?
yeah,
So the like Donald Glover, Phoebe Waller-Bridge type stars, these comedic wizards are almost exclusively in television. And when you think about which comedians are given the chance to star in movies, it's really still the same people from 15 or 20 years ago. So it's Will Ferrell and Ben Stiller and Melissa McCarthy now. And all those people are great, but they're 50 plus years old. And so I think it's harder to necessarily convince a mostly younger audience that these are stars that speak to them, right? I was thinking even Seth Rogen, who I still think of as like the young whippersnapper of comedy, is like
right.
over 40,
Yeah,
been in movies now for 15 plus years.
yeah,
So, I think there's that pipeline hasn't carried on. And so there isn't that next wave of young film comedy stars to kind of, become the next stars of these big movies.
yeah. Like that very answers my question very well. And as you're saying that, like that makes complete and utter sense. Yeah, it is so much different. And it's interesting that 20 or 30 years ago, he wanted to make the leap from TV to movies, and now it's kind of like it seems like it's the other way around, and which is just such a bizarre concept to kind of wrap your head around. But I imagine for a lot of people that are in maybe their early 20s, maybe didn't necessarily grow up going to see movies. It wasn't a big deal like it was when we were growing up. You had to go see a movie when it came out and it was in theaters, and if you didn't go, then you're gonna have to wait I don't know, 6 to 8 months or whatever until it came out in where you could rent it and stuff like that. So I imagine if you grew up with mainly just streaming and you could watch whatever movie you want to, I think, running to the movie theater to catch your favorite actor or actress is probably just not as high of a priority or an experience that a lot of younger people have had.
And I think there's been a change in terms of where we go, and maybe it's even more so where younger audiences go in terms of looking for quality, right?
Yeah.
Like, I still think there are lots of great movies being made. So it's not to say that movies don't have that capability,
Sure.
but I think especially when you're looking for movies of whatever genre that are kind of about people, right? That aren't like spectacle, but are stories.
Yeah.
So much more of that is happening on television. And so, I find especially when I'm talking to my students or people my students' age, they talk about television first and foremost, and like movies kind of come up more infrequently
Yeah.
because I think for them, in terms of their path through popular culture, that's where they found the good work to be. And like you were saying, I think it's so interesting to think about how that's changed over time. One of the things that I wrote about in Generation Friends, which is so funny now in retrospect, is that Friends becomes this giant hit show, and basically all of the coverage of the show after the first season, when it blows up and becomes this big success, is essentially takes the tack of, that's great, like congratulations on having this big hit show.
Yeah.
Oh, like you'll make some movies and we'll see if like the actors are stars or not. Like we'll
Right.
find it. And that thought would just never occur to a younger fan. And like it just that whole model doesn't exist anymore.
Right. That's so true.
Think of TV as the minor leagues and movies as the big leagues.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that funny that transition, because there was, only so many X number of channels to watch in the 90s, and then now I think it's another reason why there hasn't been a big explosion in big popular actors too, is just because there's just so many choices of where to view stuff, that there isn't just sort of the 2, 3, 4, 5 well-known actors and actresses in popular TV shows. There's so many services and so many platforms to access media that it's kind of overwhelming to take it all in and really hone in on one show or one focus.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think part of it also is that at least movie-wise, and this is true about TV too, to a somewhat lesser extent, but the things that have most captured people's attention are very much more about the characters than they are about anything else. So like, if we were talking about kind of bankable movie stars at this point, like I would point to Iron Man and Captain America, but not necessarily to Robert Downey Jr. or Chris Evans. Like I don't know that either of them could carry a movie that was not them playing those roles, but those roles bring out big audiences. And so I think that's a change, and sort of speaks to changes in the larger culture where, yeah, if we're talking about like who are big movie stars, it's still, Tom Cruise and Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts and people who were around 30 plus years ago.
Right. That's so accurate from just in my world too. It's like my favorite movies have Kristen Wiig, Melissa McCarthy, Tom Hanks. That's very accurate. They're still the ones that are pulling in, the biggest numbers in box office movies, and it's not a lot of young actors and actresses. That's a really interesting observation that I didn't really think about until this very moment. So thank you for enlightening me, because I'm a big media fan myself. So you mentioned conversations that you have with your students, and I noticed in your at the end of the book, your acknowledgments, you mentioned some of your students in your class helped with the writing of this book. What role did they play in helping with the book?
Yes, they were awesome. I worked with 3 of my former students, Julia, Aaliyah, and Zandy, and they helped with the transcriptions. So they transcribed the interviews that I'd done, and also did some really amazing research in terms of tracking down old articles about the film, stuff about the era. Like I wanted to kind of get a sense of what media coverage looked like of some of the other films of the era. And so that material ended up being hugely helpful. And it was great to just, have that assistance. Yeah.
That's so great that you were able to enlist their help. And I'm sure that they were very happy to oblige. What a great experience for a student or former student.
Yeah, it was fun for me. I hope it was fun for them too.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine. Is there any advice that you find yourself giving to students who are thinking about pursuing a career in writing that may or may not be based off of the information you learned researching Anchorman?
Yeah, I find myself giving kind of 2 pieces of advice. One of which is that it's worthwhile to kind of take big swings. That, I think sometimes, and I completely understand why, I think sometimes students are a little bit fearful of acknowledging what their hopes are for their careers, because you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. You don't want to say something that you won't be able to do. But one of the things that I remind them of is that it's so much easier to take your chances when you're younger and to go for it then. And when you get older, you have responsibilities, you might have children, for example. It becomes much harder to make big changes in your professional life. And it may, I was lucky enough that I've been able to do some of the things I wanted to do. It's definitely possible that it may not work out, but I feel like taking the chance when you have that chance is something that's very much worthwhile. The other thing that I've told students that I think is a little bit surprising to them is that, writing books is not necessarily like the sexiest version of writing that currently exists.
Sure.
But, whereas like 5 or 7 or 10 years ago, the sense in the world of writing was like, okay, soon enough, the only things that are going to exist are like BuzzFeed, and everyone's going to write for BuzzFeed. And I like BuzzFeed. It's nothing against BuzzFeed.
Yeah.
It seems like that digital writing model has not worked out quite as well as people had hoped. Whereas writing books, which is very stodgy and old and like the oldest version of writing there is basically, still seems to work, and people still seem to want to buy books, thankfully.
Yeah.
And yeah, I encourage students that if they like writing and if they're good at it, that thinking about, do I ever want to write a book? What might I ever want to write a book about? Not only is that helpful in terms of sort of broadening your potential professional horizons, but also it's actually a way to, make a living as a writer and keep it going.
Sure. Yeah. And with all your experience in writing your books and teaching your courses, have you ever contemplated the thought of writing a pilot for a TV show or a screenplay?
No, I am not funny. I know my limitations. Hopefully I'm okay at writing about people who are funny, but if I had to face the blank page and just fill it with hilarious stuff, I would not last very long. So yeah, that's not for me.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I think your writing has been just a joy to read. And again, people might think I'm biased, but as somebody that often has a hard time just sort of getting into books, and if I'm not kind of into it within the first little bit, I'm not great about kind of pushing through and continuing on. Whereas my mom reads every book and can tell you what happened on page 22 because she remembers everything in books. But your books are just so easy to digest. And I mean that in the best way possible. It's a lot of really interesting information that's like great for just sort of the general person that wants to learn more about a movie or a TV show, or somebody who's like a diehard fan. It's like the perfect balance of really interesting information written in a way that's easy to digest, but it's also very intriguing and kind of makes you think more. And I'm finding that as I read your book, kind of a big deal. And now reading the Generation Friends, as I can sort of envision these, movies, TV shows kind of coming to fruition because of the way that you're describing it is just really well done. So I'm really enjoying your books. So I'm glad that I've kind of come across them.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, this is a great addition for my pop culture library. And so before we get into our my very fun nostalgia rapid fire questions, my kind of final question about this movie in your book is, what is your favorite scene, or you can say scenes if you have a few, but your favorite scene from Anchorman?
That is a very good question. I think I especially like the kind of showdown between Ron and Veronica in the newsroom that culminates with her whipping him with the television antennas. I love it because it shows Ron at his absolute worst, and also still shows Veronica getting the best of him, knowing exactly which buttons she can press that will horrify him. So like, talking trash about his hair as being the ultimate terrible thing that one could say to a male newscaster. And, I ended up, by looking at the earlier versions of the script, I realized that the scene didn't initially end with her whipping him with the television antenna. And I thought that was just such a brilliant addition, that, he's literally being beaten with like the tools of his trade, and not in this argument, but kind of losing the larger battle as well.
Right. Yeah. I think you wrote that the what was it? The typewriter that gets thrown at him was actually made out of styrofoam or something like that, or
Yeah, exactly.
Fun. There's just so many fun tidbits like that, which just adds to the hilarity of the movie and the book. Just these little tidbits. I think one scene for me that is at the very beginning of the movie that I just have found myself thinking about randomly on a daily basis since I started reading the book and rewatching Anchorman, was when there's the kind of like a biker bar, I think, at the opening scene where they're talking about in Ron Burgundy and how everybody watches him and he, just covers the news and he's the source of all the information you need. And somebody at the bar yells, everybody, shut the hell up, Ron Burgundy's on.
Yes.
I feel like I need a t-shirt with that on it, which
it's a great scene.
Yeah, which I don't know where I'd wear that, but I love that part. There's there's so many scenes that are funny. And I think I also like the showdown scene too of all of the newscasters kind of coming together and fighting. And you do a great job describing not only that scene but sort of the setup of that in the book as well.
Yeah, it's a pretty classic scene.
Yeah, that was people. You need to. I'm not going to disclose anymore because you need to read it because it's hysterical. I think funnier than the scene itself. So to wrap up the show, I was saying offline that I don't know if you grew up watching Oprah like I did, but one thing I really enjoyed watching whenever she did interviews with people is just sort of kind of getting to know people a little bit more about just different topics kind of unrelated to their career, just sort of like fun, lighthearted, personal kind of stuff. So I know you're a big, pop culture fan. So I just have some kind of pop culture related nostalgia questions for you, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So my first one is, what record, tape, or CD, whichever you'd like, did you listen to so much that you essentially wore it out?
Well, thinking back to high school, I'm going to say Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness by Smashing Pumpkins, which I think particularly the angsty teenager that I was.
Yes. And the ability to re-listen to that album is very high. That is an excellent album. And I believe that was a classic double disc set because it was such a long album. Yeah, the Smashing Pumpkins are from Chicago, and I remember I worked with somebody that looked a lot like Billy Corgan, and it was very interesting at the time. All right, next question is, which movie from the 80s or 90s do you think you could just watch on repeat, or maybe you did watch on repeat?
I feel like as a kid, the movie that I watched the most on repeat was probably Say Anything. I would select that and also Pulp Fiction as being the two that feel highly rewatchable.
Nice. Well, that all makes sense now. Okay. So you've written this really great book about sitcoms, which I'm really excited to read because I'm a huge sitcom aficionado and love them. So in terms of just overall maybe writing and comic timing and rewatchability and kind of timelessness, which sitcom do you think is the greatest sitcom of all time? And why is it Different Strokes? No, just kidding.
How did you know my answer? Yeah, it's a tough question. I feel like I have to go with Seinfeld as just the show that kind of changed the game in terms of what sitcoms were capable of doing or what they set out to do. But I do also want to make a little bit of a pitch for The Simpsons, which sometimes gets left behind because it's animated and doesn't exactly match what people's expectations are. But
sure.
I was recently watching season 34 of The Simpsons with my kids, who have become like hardcore Simpsons fanatics. And it was exceptionally good. And I think, maybe it's like a late in life high point for the show, but still to have a show be 34 seasons in and be able to do the things that they've done with characters and storylines, I was genuinely very, very impressed by it.
Yeah, well, I mean, these people have all worked together for decades, essentially. So I'm sure it probably just gets more magical each year because they just feed off of each other and know, what skill set the other voice actors have. And I can only imagine, I think I mentioned that in one of my shows, that must be one of the most, I'm sure in reality, it's probably not as glamorous, but what an amazing job to have the same voice acting position for 30 plus years, getting to know the same people, doing something that you love, probably have, a pretty decent schedule. That sounds pretty fantastic if I were to ever do that.
Yeah, I mean, just to have a show that lasts for 6 or 8 seasons feels like an exceptional, privileged position. For this show to go on almost, 5 times or 6 times as long is just remarkable.
Yeah, it is. That is amazing. And to go back to Seinfeld for a second, so if you're ever in Brunswick, Maine, for some reason, where I live, there is an amazing, fantastic coffee shop that is owned by a really friendly guy named Ben, and he has like an old Sony, like not even 13-inch. I'm thinking like a 7 or 9-inch TV somehow hooked up to a DVD player, and all that plays is Seinfeld
I love that.
at the counter. Yeah, and they make some of the best. And I'm kind of like a coffee snob because I've had lattes and mochas or whatever you want to say, but for 25 years, and these hands down are some of the best caffeinated beverages I've ever had. So highly recommend it. It's always airing. It's like an old red Sony. I don't know how he got that set up to make it work, but it's pretty cool that you walk into this coffee shop and Seinfeld is on, and a vast majority of their customers are actually Bowdoin students. So the average age of these, kids walking in, getting coffee, seeing Seinfeld are, between the ages of 18 and 22. So hopefully they'll generate some interest in the show.
Exposing the next generation.
Yeah, they're the best means possible. It's pretty unique and pretty funny. All right, just a few more here. Be mindful of time. What was your favorite cereal to eat as a kid?
I'm gonna say corn checks.
Okay. No Mr. T or...
I don't think I did any of the like pop culture cereals. I don't remember if it was allowed or not allowed, but yeah, we had more like tasty but boring cereals.
Yeah, same here. Now that you say that, yeah, we didn't. There was always like Honey Nut Cheerios. It's like no Captain Crunch or not going to happen. Yeah. All right, 2 more questions here. What was your favorite Saturday morning cartoon?
So interestingly, I grew up Sabbath observant, so I never saw any of the Saturday morning cartoons. I was just talking with a friend recently about the gaps in my pop culture knowledge by virtue of not knowing those shows. And so, when stuff comes up more recently and people are, talking nostalgically about shows from the 80s and 90s, because I watched everything.
Yeah.
Why didn't I watch that show? It's like, oh, yeah, Saturday morning. That's why I missed it.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
A big hole in my education.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of them that I think unfortunately don't hold up very well. So in some ways, maybe that's, better than maybe not being able to see movies and stuff like that. Cause I've revisited a fair number of cartoons from the 80s and 90s through the show. And some are just, it's, interesting and kind of funny to watch for about 3 to 4 minutes, and then I just would like to watch something else. So hopefully I didn't miss too much, but I'm sure people will be upset that I said that. But
that makes me feel better.
Yeah, it's overrated. It's fine. All right. So my final question is, if you could go back in time to your childhood or adolescence, what would you do first?
I think I would like to visit the kinds of stores that don't exist anymore. Like, I think I would really like to spend about an hour just browsing the shelves at a video store, and then go to like a record store and just, hang out there for a while. I miss those kinds of stores, and I try to explain them to, my kids or whoever, and it doesn't compute. And that feels like such a huge part of being like a pop culture loving young person in the 80s and 90s, and those things have just vanished for the most part.
Yeah, that is very true. I think that's a great answer. One of my most popular shows was about all about extinct mall stores from the 80s and 90s, which was really fascinating to revisit, and remembering the merry-go-rounds and and County Seat and all these stores that kind of went by the wayside. And now people are trying to kind of bring those fashions back, but that's for another time. Well, thank you so much, Saul, for being on the show. This has been awesome. I feel like we could go on for a long time here about all of the amazing work that you've done and nostalgia and all that good stuff. But where can people get your book, and when is it coming out?
My book is coming out August 22nd, and it's available anywhere you go and buy books, hopefully.
Okay. Nice. Yeah. Well, there's so many places to do that. And in closing, I thought maybe I would just read one quick little excerpt from this. So one thing I really appreciated kind of towards the end of the book, as you talked a little bit about just how important comedy has been in our lives and kind of how therapeutic it can be. But one thing that you wrote was, quote, "Laughter will solve precisely none of our problems, personal and collective. But if there's any salve for our pain and our grief that genuinely works, that lifts us out of our melancholy and provides us with brief snatches of bliss, it is comedy. Comedy has a capacity to force us to forget our troubles for a moment and be reminded of life's pleasures, of our collective infinite capacity for foolishness and stupidity, and to take comfort in our idiocy," which I think is a really great way to describe Anchorman.
Yes.
Yeah, it sums it up quite well. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Saul. I really, really appreciate it. And your books have been so much fun to read. And I really hope that people will go out and get not only Kind of a Big Deal, but some of your other works as well.
Thank you so much. This was really a pleasure to get to talk with you.
Yes, likewise.